Something fundamental inside the American power system has already changed. Not something that might change, not a future realignment, but a structural shift that is already underway. Even if most public explanations are still framed as scandal, personality, or political drama, what the public is being told is that this is another chapter in the Epstein story, another resurfacing of documents, another cycle of names, denials, and reputational damage. That explanation is incomplete. What's actually happening beneath the headlines is not about exposure. It's about containment. It's about how institutions respond when accumulated documentation begins to threaten not individuals, but the credibility architecture that protects elite continuity. The emergence of new Epstein-related records, particularly those that contradict prior public claims, is not destabilizing because of what they allege. It's destabilizing because of where they point. They point to a system that manages accountability asymmetrically. They expose how attention is redirected, how narratives are narrowed, and how structural power protects itself by sacrificing what is expendable. This is not chaos. This is a system reacting to a loss of narrative control. And once narrative control weakens, institutions don't improvise, they reorganize. Mainstream media is structurally incapable of explaining moments like this. Not because journalists are dishonest, but because the incentives of the system they operate within reward events, not structures. Media coverage is optimized for immediacy, for conflict between named actors, for statements and counterstatements. But structural transitions do not announce themselves that way. They unfold through language shifts, procedural delays, selective amplification, and quiet recalibration of institutional posture. When new documents emerge, media logic asks, who lied? Who looks worse? Who will respond next? Institutional logic asks something entirely different. Where does exposure stop? Who absorbs it? And how much system credibility is at risk if scrutiny widens? This is where the public explanation collapses. Because media narratives frame attention as accountability. Institutions frame attention as risk. And risk is not distributed evenly. Complexity is avoided in coverage because complexity threatens audience retention. But complexity is embraced by institutions because it creates insulation, not through conspiracy, through structure. What looks like confusion from the outside is often deliberate narrowing on the inside. To understand this moment, you have to step back. The American institutional system was not designed to maximize transparency. It was designed to maximize stability. During the mid-20th century, that stability served a broad base. Post-war growth aligned political legitimacy, economic expansion, and social mobility. But by the 1970s, that alignment fractured. Financialization accelerated, regulatory power shifted, capital gained mobility while labor remained fixed. Each major realignment followed the same pattern. During the New Deal era, institutions resisted redistribution until systemic collapse made resistance impossible. After the 1970s, deregulation wasn't framed as a power transfer. It was framed as efficiency. After 2008, accountability was rhetorically promised, but structurally contained. Markets were stabilized. Institutions survived. Trust did not. What we are witnessing now follows that lineage. Elite networks grow complex over time. Documentation accumulates. Eventually, exposure pressure exceeds the system's ability to ignore it. At that point, the question is never, is this wrong? The question is, how much disclosure can the system absorb without destabilizing itself? That question is being asked again, quietly, right now. And the answer will not come through outrage or confession. It will come through reallocation of attention. The trigger for this phase of institutional recalibration is not Jeffrey Epstein himself. That chapter, in many ways, is already closed in the public imagination. The trigger is documentation, specifically records that directly contradict a clean, time-bound public claim. That contact with Epstein ended at a defined moment in the past. According to publicly reported disclosures, the newly surfaced materials include email correspondence, logistical coordination, and records of continued interaction well beyond the date previously asserted. They reference organized travel, invitations to events, financial participation in social and philanthropic functions, and personal communication involving family matters. On their own, these details do not establish criminal conduct. That distinction matters, but structurally, they establish something far more important: continuity. Continuity removes ambiguity. Continuity collapses plausible deniability. Continuity turns a reputational issue into an institutional one. Previous Epstein-related controversies were absorbed because they were episodic, fragmented, narratively diffuse. This moment is different because it compresses the timeline. When documents show sustained interaction rather than isolated contact, institutions no longer evaluate morality. They evaluate containment boundaries. Where does scrutiny stop? What happens if it doesn't? That is why this moment is not another scandal cycle. It is a decision point. And once institutions reach a decision point, reversal becomes difficult, not because of public pressure, but because internal risk assessments begin to lock in. Institutions do not respond emotionally. They respond structurally. Inside federal agencies, the response has not been escalation. It has been procedural narrowing. Statements are limited, jurisdiction is emphasized, scope is carefully defined. This is not avoidance, it is insulation. When exposure threatens to expand beyond an individual and toward a network, institutions reduce surface area. They avoid language that could trigger discovery, precedent, or compelled disclosure. Congressional reaction follows a similar pattern. Public rhetoric remains performative and fragmented. Privately, there is no appetite for broad reopening, not because of loyalty to individuals, but because institutional precedent matters. Once disclosure thresholds shift, they rarely shift back. Financial institutions are even more revealing. Markets do not care about scandal, they care about uncertainty. The reappearance of Epstein-linked documentation does not threaten asset values directly. What it threatens is predictability. When elite proximity to unresolved exposure becomes visible again, counterparties reassess reputational and political risk. Quietly, incrementally. No panic, no announcements, just recalibration. This is why attention appears to be concentrating on figures with high visibility but limited structural leverage. From a systems perspective, this is rational. Visibility satisfies public accountability demands. Containment preserves institutional continuity. This is where the concept of a fall guy becomes analytically useful, not as an accusation, but as a function. The system does not need to invent guilt. It needs to localize risk. And localization requires a narrative anchor. At moments like this, it's tempting to ask who is guilty. But structurally, that is the wrong question. The correct question is, who gains power from the way exposure is managed, and who loses it? In the current configuration of the American system, power is concentrated not in visibility, but in insulation. Those with the deepest institutional embedding, through capital, legal architecture, political connectivity, and transnational leverage, are the least exposed to direct accountability, not because they are untouchable, but because they are structurally expensive to confront. Exposure carries costs. It destabilizes donor networks. It disrupts political coalitions. It introduces legal precedent. It weakens market confidence. As a result, systems tend to redirect pressure toward actors who are visible enough to absorb attention, but not essential enough to destabilize core functions. This is not ideology. It is self-preservation. And this is where the distinction between Main Street and institutional capital becomes unavoidable. When accountability is selectively applied, ordinary Americans internalize the cost through declining trust, higher risk premiums, weaker wage leverage, and political cynicism. They are told the system is chaotic. In reality, it is highly disciplined. Discipline does not mean fairness, it means control. The long-term consequences of this pattern are not immediate collapse. They are gradual transformation. Democratic stability weakens when citizens observe that documentation does not reliably lead to accountability, especially when proximity to power appears to determine outcome. Economic confidence erodes not because markets fear scandal, but because markets fear unpredictability in governance norms. Global credibility declines when allies and adversaries alike recognize that transparency is negotiated rather than systemic. And, perhaps most importantly, institutional legitimacy becomes conditional, not on performance, but on narrative maintenance. This forces institutions into a defensive posture. They become more procedural, more risk-averse, less adaptive. Over time, this reduces strategic autonomy. The system can still project power, but it becomes less capable of reforming itself internally. That is the cost of containment over correction. And history shows that when correction is deferred long enough, it eventually arrives under far less controlled conditions. So, this moment should not be understood as another Epstein story, nor as a personality-driven scandal. It should be understood as a structural signal. A signal that accumulated documentation is once again testing the boundaries of elite protection. A signal that institutions are choosing containment over confrontation. And a signal that power inside the American system continues to flow toward insulation, not transparency. This is not temporary turbulence. It is a transition. Systems always resist change before adapting. And the resistance you're seeing is not political. It's systemic. So, consider this. If accountability depends on where you sit within the power structure, can legitimacy survive indefinitely? And if institutions preserve stability by narrowing truth, what happens when truth no longer fits inside those boundaries? If you value calm, structural analysis of how American power actually works, I invite you to comment below and subscribe to U.S. Power Report. In our next report, we'll examine another U.S. institutional shift already forming, one where legal authority, financial alignment, and geopolitical signaling are beginning to collide in ways the public narrative still can't explain.